It's a summer morning, maybe 10,000 years ago, and the ground you're standing on is dry. Reed beds run along the edge of a slow brown river. There's oak here, and hazel, the smell of wood smoke drifting low over the water. A hunting party is moving across open country at first light, following the deer tracks pressed into the mud along the bank. Birds lifting off the marsh. A child somewhere behind them. This is home. People were born here and buried here for thousands of years. Now stand in the same spot today. There's no river, there's no oak, there's gray water in every direction, a container ship somewhere on the horizon dragging its wake across a cold, flat sea. The ground that hunting party walked on is down there in the dark, under the southern North Sea, and it has been for 8,000 years. This isn't a fantasy, and it isn't Atlantis. There's no lost super civilization here, no hidden pyramids, nothing the elites covered up. It's a real country. It had a name, a shape, rivers you could map. It's under the sea right now, off the coast of England, and for about 100 years, we drew it as an empty bridge, a blank strip of land the first Britons supposedly walked across on their way to becoming British. A corridor, a footnote. The whole argument of his film is that the footnote was the story. Last year, scientists drilled into the mud off the English coast and read the DNA still locked inside it, and what they found should change where we say the British actually came from. But we'll get to the mud. Start with the harder thing. Start with how you lose an entire country so completely that its own descendants forget it was ever there. The land is called Doggerland. It's named after the Dogger Bank, that shallow rise far out in the North Sea, and the name itself is surprisingly new. The archaeologist Brian E. Coles gave the lost country its name in the 1990s, which tells you something on its own. A whole landmass, inhabited for millennia, and we didn't even have a word for it until a few decades ago. Here's the scale of it. During the last ice age and into the warming that followed, from the late Pleistocene into the early Holocene, Britain was not an island. The sea was lower, locked up in ice, and where the North Sea is now, there was land. Not a thin causeway, a full landscape, rolling low hills, freshwater lakes, winding rivers, salt marsh and forest, and coast. Doggerland joined the east of Britain to the Netherlands, to Denmark, to the whole northern edge of Europe. And Britain was simply the high western ground of a much larger continent. And it was full of life. Mammoth moved across it in the colder stretches. Red deer, wild horses, aurochs, the huge wild cattle that make a modern cow look small. Beaver in the rivers, boar in the woods, water birds coming off the marshes in their thousands. And people, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, following the herds and the rivers and the seasons, living the way people lived everywhere before, farming, in small bands, on the move, deeply at home in a landscape they knew intimately. Picture what a life there actually looked like. You'd know the rivers the way you know the streets where you grew up. You'd know which reed beds held birds in spring and where the deer came down to drink at dusk. You'd fish the estuaries, work the antler and flint into tools, follow the game inland in one season and back to the coast in another. Nobody there was passing through on the way to somewhere better. It was somebody's whole world, and it stayed somebody's whole world for thousands of years. For a long time, though, that was just a theory, a reasonable guess about low sea levels and old geography. And then the sea started handing back the proof, and it handed it back to some very confused fishermen. For decades, fishing trawlers working the North Sea have dragged their nets across the seabed and pulled up things that have no business being at the bottom of the ocean. Mammoth teeth, deer antler, aurochs bone, lumps of ancient peat the fishermen called moorlog, compressed vegetation from a land surface that used to sit in the open air. Crews would haul up a net expecting fish and find a fistful of ancient forest instead. And often enough, they'd curse it and throw it back, because it fouled the gear. The seafloor was quietly giving up the remains of a country, one snagged net at a time. And for years, almost nobody was really listening. The moment it became undeniable came in 1931. A trawler called the Colinda was working the water near the Lehman and Ower banks when it hauled up a block of that old peat, and buried inside the peat was a tool, a barbed harpoon point, carved from antler, made by a human hand. It's known now as the Colinda point, and you have to sit with what it means. A hunting weapon shaped by someone dropped or lost, and then swallowed by a rising sea and preserved for thousands of years at the bottom of the North Sea. Not a natural object, a made thing. Somebody had stood on that ground and hunted there. That harpoon is the whole case in miniature. There was a country down there, and there were people in it, and they hunted, and they made things, and one of those things came back up in a fishing net 9,000 years later. Once you've seen the Colinda Point, the idea of an empty bridge gets very hard to hold on to. And yet, somehow, we held on to it anyway. So here's the strange part. We had the bones, we had the tools, we had the harpoon from 1931, and the maps, and the name by the 1990s. And still, for most of the last century, Doggerland got treated as a bridge. Think about what that word does. A bridge is a thing you cross. It's the empty space between two real places, and all the meaning sits at the two ends. In the story we told ourselves, the real history happened in Europe, and the real history happened in Britain. And Doggerland was just the gap in the middle that people hurried across to get from one to the other. Nobody lived on a bridge. You didn't stop there. You didn't bury your dead there. It was scenery. Part of that was a failure of imagination, but part of it was just how hard the evidence was to reach. You can't walk Doggerland, you can't dig it. Everything you'd want to know is buried underwater and then under meters of seabed sediment. And getting at it cost enormous amounts of money, ships, drilling rigs, survey equipment. So the emptiness was convenient. If reaching the proof is that expensive, it's a lot easier to assume there isn't much proof to reach, and to write the whole place off as a corridor. And that gave us a genuinely odd situation. One of the richest, oldest chapters in the human story of Britain was sitting offshore, underwater, out of reach. So we quietly wrote it out of the story and pretended Britain's deep past just started thin. There's a habit of mind underneath this that's worth naming because it shapes how we tell history everywhere. We tend to treat the places that survive as the places that mattered, and the places that vanished as scenery. The land that's still above water gets to be the setting of the story. The land that drowned becomes the gap between chapters. It's a completely understandable bias because the surviving land is the land you can stand on and study. But it quietly rewrites the past into whatever's convenient to reach. We built the history of the first Britons around the moment people showed up on this island, drew a neat line at the coast, and never really asked where they'd been living in the long ages before that. Because before that, a lot of them may have been living on ground that was about to disappear. The drowning of Doggerland was not a single dramatic night. For most of its history, it was slow, and that might be the most haunting part. As the last great ice sheets melted, all that water went back into the ocean, and the sea began to rise. Year by year, generation by generation, the coastline crept inland. The low ground flooded first. The rivers backed up. The salt marsh spread where the freshwater marsh had been. Land that a grandfather had hunted was open water by the time his grandchildren were grown. People would have watched it happen, not as a catastrophe most years, but as a slow, grinding loss. A familiar hunting ground gone brackish, a camp that had to move a little further inland every few years. A river mouth that used to be a day's walk from the sea, now with salt water pushing up it. A world getting smaller around them, and no way to stop it. There would have been stories passed down about ground that older people remembered walking on, that the young ones only ever saw as water. Whole generations living through the quiet disappearance of their own country and calling it, probably, just the way things were. And then, around 8,150 years ago, came the violent chapter. Off the coast of Norway, a colossal section of the seafloor gave way and collapsed in an underwater landslide. We're talking about a slab of the continental shelf the size of a small country, sliding into the deep. It's called the Storegga slide, and it displaced so much water that it sent a tsunami surging out across the North Sea and over the low remaining lands of Doggerland. Deposits from that wave have been found along the coasts of Scotland and Norway, pushed far inland and dating from right around that time. For the people still living on that shrinking country, on that day, the sea didn't creep. It came in a wall, all at once, and there would have been almost no warning and almost nowhere to run. Britain finished separating from the continent around 8,000 years ago. That's the moment, in effect, that Britain became an island. Not a myth flood, not a story handed down and exaggerated. A real sea, rising over a real homeland, with real families on the last high ground, watching the country they were born in go under for good. For a long time, that's where the story stopped. A lost land, a slow flood, a tsunami, and then silence. We knew roughly what happened. We had almost no way to see it. And this is the turn, because this is where the evidence gets tested. Because we stopped guessing about Doggerland and we started reading it directly. The first breakthrough was mapping. Vincent Gaffney, working with a team at the University of Bradford on a project called Lost Frontiers, took seismic survey data, the same kind of data the oil and gas industry uses to see through the seabed, and used it to reconstruct the drowned geography of Doggerland. And a real landscape came back into focus. Hills, lakes, coastlines, and a major waterway they named the Southern River, a drowned river system winding across the sunken plain. For the first time, you could look at a map of Doggerland. That wasn't a guess. It was a place with features with somewhere a person might have chosen to live. But a map is still just the shape of the land. It can't tell you what grew there, or what lived there, or when. For that, you need the land itself to have kept a record. And it turns out it did. On the 10th of March, 2026, a study was published in the journal PNAS with a title that sounds dry and is anything but. It was led by Robin Alibi, a professor at the University of Warwick, working with Gaffney and others, and its method is the thing to understand. They used sedimentary ancient DNA. Sediment DNA dredged straight from the seabed. Here's what that means. When plants and animals live and die in a place, they shed genetic material into the soil, into the mud, into the layers that build up over time. Pollen, leaf litter, skin, waste, decay, all of it leaves molecular traces. And under the right conditions, buried and cold and undisturbed, that DNA can survive for tens of thousands of years, locked in the sediment like a message in a bottle that was never meant to be sent. You don't need a bone or a body. You don't need a fossil or a tool. You just need the mud and a way to read what's written in it. It's one of the most powerful things that's happened to archaeology in a generation, because it turns ordinary dirt into a library. And the seabed off Britain turned out to be an extraordinary library, because it had been sealed. Once Doggerland went under, those old land surfaces were buried, starved of oxygen, kept cold and still. The exact conditions that destroyed DNA on a dry, disturbed, farmed landscape are the conditions the drowning shut out. The same sea that took Doggerland away is, in a strange way, the reason so much of it is still readable at all. So the team drilled. They took 252 samples from 41 seafloor cores running along that drowned southern river and pulled up columns of ancient seabed reaching back roughly 16,000 years. It's described as the largest sedimentary DNA study of its kind ever attempted. And then they read the DNA the mud had been holding onto since before Britain was an island and asked it a simple question: what was living here? The answer rewrote the timeline. They found temperate woodland, oak, elm, hazel, the trees of a mild green living country, and they found it present more than 16,000 years ago. That's the part that stops you. It's thousands of years earlier than the old pollen records had suggested, and crucially, it's earlier than forests like that had spread across Britain itself, which points to something remarkable. Doggerland may have been a refugium. That word is worth slowing down on. During an ice age, life doesn't spread evenly across a frozen map. It retreats into pockets, sheltered places with a kinder local climate, where plants and animals ride out the cold and wait. When the ice finally pulls back, those pockets are the seed banks the whole region regrows from. A northern refugium this far up, this early, is not what the textbooks led anyone to expect. It means Doggerland wasn't a bleak strip of tundra people trudged across. It was a warm, wooded, sheltered heart in a frozen world, exactly the kind of place life clings to, and exactly the kind of place people would want to be. If you're finding this as strange and as moving as I am, take a second and subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly this kind of story, the ones where the honest version turns out stranger than the myth. Now, back to what the mud remembered. It remembered more than trees. The team detected DNA from a genus of tree that was thought to have vanished from the region around 400,000 years ago, still present here far later than anyone believed possible. Think about that number for a second. 400,000 years is deeper than our own species reaches in most of Europe, and here's a living survivor from that lost world, hanging on in a corner of the continent that we'd written off as an empty floodplain. They found the signatures of animals, too. Boar rooting through the woods, deer, bears, aurochs, a full living ecosystem written into the mud, the whole food web a hunter-gatherer band would have depended on, right there in the DNA. And they found something about the sea itself. The North Sea, in this part of Doggerland, formed later than we thought. Parts of the country survived the Storegga tsunami and stayed dry longer than the old models allowed, some of it holding on until around 7,000 years ago. And then Alibi's team took the careful, powerful step. They didn't claim to have found people. They said something more restrained and, if you think about it, more devastating. This early, warm, wooded, resource-rich land could have supported early Mesolithic communities before the flooding, and its drowning may help explain a real long-standing puzzle: why so little early Mesolithic evidence survives on the British mainland today. Sit with that inference, because it flips the whole problem. For years, the thinness of Britain's earliest record looked like an absence. Not many early sites, not much early evidence, as if the first people here left barely a trace. But what if the record isn't missing? What if it's just offshore? What if the reason Britain's deepest past feels so faint is that the people weren't concentrated on what is now Britain at all? They were out there, on the warm wooded lowland, in the part that is now underwater. So maybe the evidence was never really lost at all. Maybe it's just sitting under the sea, in the dark, with the country it belonged to. That's a genuine change in the story. And now comes the part where an honest film has to hold the line. Because here's exactly what this study did and did not find. It found the DNA of the land, the trees, the animals, the ecology, the timeline, the climate. It did not find human DNA. It did not find settlements. It did not find graves or hearths or bones or names. Nobody has recovered the people of Doggerland. The presence of those Mesolithic families is a strong, well-supported inference drawn from a now proven habitable environment. It is not a direct discovery, and the difference matters. And we have to be just as clear about what Doggerland was. This is a real drowned homeland, and it's a story about human beings. So it deserves to be told with weight. But it was a country of hunter-gatherer bands, not a lost empire. No cities, no pyramids, no hidden advanced technology. Calling it Britain's drowned nation is an honest emotional frame for a genuine inhabited homeland. And it's a completely different thing from the Atlantis myth, the drowned super-civilization the internet loves. The Atlantis version is a fantasy. This is the real one, and the real one is stranger and better, which is precisely the point. So look honestly at what's still open. We don't know how many people live there, whether it was hundreds or many thousands. We don't know exactly when the last dry patch of Doggerland finally slipped under, or what the very last people on it did as the ground shrank beneath them. We don't know which modern British lineages, if any, trace back to those bands, or whether their descendants are walking around Britain today with no idea their oldest homeland is under the sea. We don't have a single one of them by name, or a single grave, or the floor of a single house. The people who called that country home are still down there, unrecovered. And archaeologists are still arguing over almost everything about them. How many, how long, how far the settlements spread, and whether the crucial early sites are gone for good or just waiting under the right patch of seabed for the next core to come up. And that's the honest state of it. Nothing about Doggerland is settled. For the first time, though, it's genuinely open, and the questions are the good kind, the kind you can actually go and drill for. The title of this film asks whether that seabed DNA could finally solve the mystery of Britain's drowned nation. And the honest answer keeps the word could. What's genuinely been solved is the shape of the story, not the people. The story, for 100 years, that story was an empty bridge the first Britons crossed to get here. The evidence now tells a different one. A warm, living, forested homeland, older and more habitable than anyone thought, that people very likely came from, and that drowned beneath them. Which changes the oldest question we've been asking about the first Britons. For a century we asked how they arrived, as if Britain were the destination, and everything before it was just the journey. But the evidence points the other way. They didn't so much arrive in Britain as retreat into it. The land they were actually from was going under, mile by mile, and then all at once. And the survivors carried whatever they could and whatever they remembered up onto the high western ground that the rising sea had spared. We call that high ground Britain. To them, it may have been the edge of a country that was disappearing. And there's something quietly heavy in that, if you let it land. We tend to think of the deep origins of Britain as a story of people coming to this island, waves of arrivals, each adding to what was here. But the seabed DNA points to a chapter that runs the other way, where the founding experience wasn't discovery, it was loss. The first people we can meaningfully call ancestors here may have carried, in whatever songs and stories they had, the memory of a green homeland going under the water. A grief older than farming, older than writing, older than anything we have a record of, sitting right at the root of the family tree. And then, slowly, over 8,000 years, even the memory drained away, until their descendants could stand on a beach in Norfolk and have no idea they were looking out at the graveyard of the place they came from. This isn't a legend. It isn't Atlantis. It's a real place, under a real sea, and its loss is written into how empty Britain's own deep past can feel, because a huge part of that past isn't buried under British soil. It's out under the water. So look at the North Sea now. Gray, ordinary, busy with ships, Freight moving across it every hour of every day, and almost nobody aboard those ships giving a single thought to what's beneath the keel. But the floor of that sea is Britain's oldest graveyard. It holds a homeland, and right now, slowly, a core sample of mud at a time, it's finally starting to give that homeland back. We called our first homeland a bridge, and we drew it empty for 100 years. I want to know what you think that was really about. Was it just that the evidence was too expensive to reach? Or was an empty bridge simply easier to live with than the truth? That we came from a country the sea took, and then we forgot it? Tell me down in the comments, and if you want the next story we pull up out of the dark, subscribe, and I'll see you there.